no doubt aware of from lab. The right atrium anteriorly has a combed appearance. This is the musculi pectinati or pectinate muscle. Differentiating the anterior from the posterior right atrium is the terminal crest or crista terminalis. On the medial aspect of the right atrium, we have the fossa ovale. Prior to birth, that fossa was open and known as the foramen ovale. The walls of both the ventricles are lined with trabeculae carnae. This translates into little meaty beams. Coming out of those trabeculae carnae, or out of the walls of the ventricles, are the papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are attached to the valves in both the right and left ventricle via the chordae tendineae. As the right and left ventricle contracts, the papillary muscles will also contract, tensioning the chordae tendineae and tensioning the valves, such to prevent backflow of blood. So as the papillary muscles contract, they hold the valves closed. So blood will exit the right ventricle via the pulmonary semilunar valve and pulmonary trunk, and blood will exit the left ventricle via the aortic semilunar valve or the aorta. The heart has its own conduction system and is, of course, under the power of the autonomic nervous system. It all starts with the SA node that is located just inside the right atrium in relation to the superior vena cava. The SA node, or sinoatrial node, contains a specialized group of cells that can manifest spontaneous depolarizations. This is why it is known as the pacemaker of the heart. That pace, unimpeded, would run about 100 to 110 beats a minute. The SA node provides a signal through both atria to the AV node, or atrioventricular node. This is located just medial and superior to the right AV valve. The signal then travels from the AV node to the bundle of His, which is at the superior aspect of the interventricular septum. That signal will then travel down the right and left crura, causing the ventricles to contract. From this crura, there are invaginations of nerves that come up into the papillary muscles, such that the papillary muscles are contracting as the ventricular walls are contracting. Since the rhythm of the heart is autonomic, any conduction blockage can affect that rhythm. Rhythm of the heart is also intrinsic or self-contained from the SA node. Rhythm of the heart, or pace of the heart, can be influenced by the autonomic influences, such as the cardiac nerves from the sympathetic trunk or the vagus nerves from the parasympathetic nervous system. The cardiac nerves, as you know, are specialized sympathetic nerves, and the vagus nerve, which is a parasympathetic nerve, cranial nerve 10, come together to form the cardiac plexus. The cardiac plexus will then differentiate into a coronary plexus. This coronary plexus will branch to innervate the coronary arteries as long as innervate parts of the conduction system itself. It is the influence of the parasympathetic nervous system that makes our resting heart rate go lower than the intrinsic rate of the sinoatrial node. Blood supply or plumbing to the heart comes from two main vessels that originate in the ascending aorta. The right coronary artery exits the aorta and travels around through the coronary sulcus between the aorta and the ventricles. As it wraps the heart, it gives off a right marginal branch and continues around the posterior side of the heart within the sulcus. The right coronary will then give off a posterior interventricular branch and continue. The left coronary artery is relatively short and generally mostly obscured by the pulmonary trunk. The left coronary artery pops out from underneath the trunk in order to divide into the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. Circumflex simply means to bend around. The circumflex artery will travel in the coronary sulcus to branch off the left marginal artery. It will then continue to meet up with the right coronary artery. The circumflex artery and the right coronary artery meet approximately at the posterior middle portion of the left atrium, such that an occlusion to the right coronary and or an occlusion to the circumflex can cause ischemia in the posterior left atria. You will have one or more occlusion questions on your exam. Hopefully these occlusion questions are not questions you'll have to memorize, but questions you'll be able to see in your mind's eye from your work in the lab. An occlusion of the anterior interventricular artery will cause ischemia to the anterior portion of the right and left ventricles. An occlusion of the circumflex artery will cause an ischemia to the left atrium and left ventricle. Thus, an occlusion of the left coronary artery, which will affect the circumflex and anterior interventricular arteries, will cause an ischemia in the left atrium, left ventricle, and right ventricle. The right coronary artery, if it's occluded, the right atrium and right ventricle will be affected. The posterior right and left ventricle would be affected. The left atrium will be affected. And the lower right ventricle will be affected due to the right marginal being affected. If the posterior interventricular artery is damaged, you will have ischemia to the posterior right and left ventricles. On the exam, I'm not going to try to get too fancy. If you know where the arteries are on the anterior, posterior sides of the heart, you should be able to figure out where the ischemia is going to be. Running with these arteries are some main veins of the heart you need to know. Running with the anterior interventricular artery, as well as the circumflex artery, is the great cardiac vein. The great cardiac vein will therefore drain the anterior right and left ventricles, along with the posterior left ventricle and posterior left atrium, where it will then drain into the coronary sinus. The middle cardiac vein, which runs with the posterior interventricular artery, will drain the posterior right and left ventricle, while the small cardiac vein that runs with the right coronary artery will drain the right atria and ventricle on the posterior side. Draining the anterior right ventricle are a specialized set of veins known as the anterior cardiac veins. The anterior cardiac veins specifically drain the right ventricle, the anterior right ventricle, into the right atrium. And this is directly into the right atrium. So, which vessels drain directly into the right atrium? Well, there are four: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus, and the anterior cardiac veins all drain directly into the right atrium. These are not all of the veins, obviously, that are associated with the heart. There are approximately twice as many veins on the heart, or maybe more, than there are arteries. But these are the major ones that you should know. We've discussed and looked at and named many arteries and veins in the body, but really haven't discussed their similarities or differences. Arteries and veins come in generally three sizes. They both have three layers and are lined with the same types of cells. So arteries and veins come in three sizes: large, medium, and small. Examples of large arteries would be the aorta. A large vein would be the vena cava. Medium arteries would include the brachial artery. An artery like the radial artery, for example, would be also considered a medium-sized artery. The cephalic vein, basilic vein, median cubital vein, all would be considered medium-sized veins. Small arteries and veins are considered muscular branches coming off medium-sized veins. Both arteries and veins have three specific layers. Internally, both arteries and veins are lined with simple squamous epithelium known as endothelial cells. Both have a middle layer known as the media. Both have an outer layer known as the adventitia. The adventitia and the media will vary in its components between arteries and veins. Again, the lining of both arteries and veins are lined with simple squamous epithelial cells called endothelial cells. This is both in arteries and veins. Differences between arteries and veins include the intima and media in arteries are more elastic. The pressure on the arterial side of circulation is much higher. When you think the heart as a pump is pumping blood from larger to smaller arteries, which are then potentially impeded at the muscles, such that the pressure in general is higher on the arterial side than the venous side. The elastic fibers within the arteries help the arteries accommodate for these changes in pressure. Arteries also have more smooth muscle in the media. This smooth muscle acts to vasodilate and vasoconstrict as we go from a more dependent to a more independent posture. Failure of the arteries to adequately vasoconstrict during changes of position is known as orthostatic hypotension. Large veins contain longitudinal bundles of smooth muscle in their outer layer or adventitia, where arteries only contain connective tissue in their adventitia, no matter what the size. Additionally, veins control flow with valves. The valves within veins are one-way